Hey guys, tonight we wander into the dunes near Turpan to find a breeze-proof library buried in silence. Picture this, a lonely breeze dragging curls of copper-red dust across the Taklamakan desert. The sun is slowly falling like a peach into the horizon, casting that peachy orange light across rippling sand dunes. You're standing barefoot, probably a mistake, on a stone path just warm enough to sting. The desert is quiet in that way only deserts can be. Not silent, but hushed. Like the world is whispering through its teeth. Somewhere far off, a donkey sneezes. You squint ahead, where two rock walls lean into each other like old friends. Between them, the faint promise of green. Not a mirage, not a trick of light. But real, an oasis. And not just any oasis, but a place where monks once built libraries that could survive the wind, the heat, the sand, and maybe even time itself. You probably won't survive a week here without sunburn and a strong disagreement with your digestive tract. But tonight, you're just passing through, nice and safe under a blanket. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all dozing off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a few more steps. The wind plays with your sleeves. You smell dry earth, something floral, maybe desert jasmine, and the faint scent of animal fur. The oasis finally opens up like a folded letter, revealing a green pocket of trees, slanted gardens, and strange openings carved into cliffs. This isn't just a campsite or a forgotten village. This is where the ancient Uighurs built their idea of forever. Windproof libraries? Sounds like something from a quirky Pinterest board. But here, in the Turpan Basin, one of the hottest, driest places on Earth centuries ago, they managed it. These weren't just buildings, they were acts of resistance. Resistance against erosion, against heatstroke, against memory loss. What you're seeing is a network of cave libraries. Think of them as hobbit holes, if hobbits were Buddhist scholars who copied manuscripts while hiding from sandstorms. These cave libraries are part of what's known as the Bezeklik 1000 Buddha Caves. There aren't 1,000, unless you count each frescoed toe, but there are plenty, and each one was a quiet rebellion against forgetfulness. The entrance to the nearest cave is barely taller than you. The door, if you can call it that, is just a cloth drape, worn and sun-bleached, hanging limp. You push it aside and step in. Cool air wraps around you like a ceramic bowl fresh from the stream. Inside, there's silence. Not the fake silence of noise-canceling headphones. The real thing. Your ears stretch out, trying to grab onto something, anything. Then you see it. Shelves carved into the stone itself. No mahogany, no varnish, no fancy library ladders with wheels. Just cubbies in sandstone, each holding bundles of paper wrapped in cloth, some scorched around the edges by time, others still surprisingly crisp. Historians believe the Uighurs began settling here around the 9th century, when they moved south from Mongolia. They brought their own language, script, and religious mix, Buddhism, Manichaeism, a bit of Nestorian Christianity. Yes, desert monks were surprisingly ecumenical. By the time they found Turpan, they were already masters of building in extremes. But why build in caves? Well, apart from being cool in summer and tolerable in winter, caves are naturally windproof. Sort of like Mother Nature's panic rooms. No windows to rattle, no doors to blow off, and just enough humidity from nearby springs to keep the paper from turning to crisp tortilla chips. Add a few design tweaks: angled corridors, mud brick facades, gravel paths to prevent sand tracking, and voila! Desert data centers. Now, you walk slowly through the dusty chamber. The ceiling curves overhead like the inside of a seashell. The air is dry but breathable, and there's a smell like old paper, wax, and maybe dried apricots? You pause by one of the scrolls. The cloth is tied with a simple knot, the ends frayed and gentle. You could open it, but you don't. Not yet. There's a kind of sacred patience here. The kind that comes from people who knew that writing wasn't just recording. It was preserving breath, spirit, presence. One scroll sits slightly open. You catch a glimpse of Uighur script, tall, looping characters that lean forward, as if in mid-step. Beautiful, angular, like someone tried to draw dancing reeds in the wind. Mainstream historians agree the Uighur script evolved from the Sogdian alphabet, but here's your fringe tidbit: some folks think the angles and curves were adapted specifically to be read by flickering lamplight in caves like these. No proof, but it's a delightful image, letters built to sway with candlelight. You sit on a flat rock ledge, just beneath a carved niche where perhaps a candle once stood. You imagine a monk, cross-legged, copying one word at a time. You wonder how many hours he sat before he even blinked. And how many grains of sand tried, and failed, to sneak in from the outside. Historians still argue whether these libraries were meant primarily for public learning, monastic meditation, or imperial record-keeping. The truth? Maybe all three. The Uighurs weren't just wandering desert mystics. They were cultural archivists, practical architects, and low-key geniuses of thermal insulation. As the shadows stretch longer across the floor, you lie back on the stone bench. Outside, the desert wind whooshes by, but in here, it's barely a sigh. You can feel the age of the place, not in a heavy way, but like a hand lightly resting on your chest, reminding you that you're not the first visitor, and hopefully not the last. You close your eyes. No snoring yet. Just sand, wind, and the hush of knowledge, packed tightly into walls that don't need to shout. You stumble upon the Bezeklik caves, part monastery, part archive, hidden in a lush green cleft of sand. As your eyes adjust to the gentle dimness inside the cave, you start to notice the walls. They're not just bare rock, no, these walls are canvases. Paintings cover nearly every inch. You tilt your head, mouth slightly open, as you trace the outlines of serene faces, gold halos, and pastel robes. Rows of tiny Buddhas seated in meditation, some cross-legged, others standing with hands raised in mudras, ritual gestures that somehow feel like they're saying both welcome and ashish. These are the famous frescoes of the Bezeklik caves. Each image, painted with mineral-based pigments and natural binders, still clings to the walls like memories that refuse to fade. Some have cracked, others have peeled, but most are still surprisingly vivid. The scenes are more than religious art, they're stories. Monks meditating under trees, scholars debating under paper lanterns, a mother reading to her child. You realize this wasn't just a temple or a storage room. It was a place where wisdom was shared, absorbed, lived. Outside, the desert simmers. But here, tucked between cliffs, a green strip of earth coils like a sleeping dragon. Poplar trees line a shallow stream. The oasis is no accident. The Uighurs knew exactly where to settle, where underground water could be coaxed to the surface, where the cliffs could block the worst of the wind, and where their libraries could nest safely inside stone. You step back outside, squinting as the light bounces off the pale rock. A few paces downhill, you find what looks like another entrance. You duck in, and this one's different. More austere. No frescoes. Just wall niches, shelves, and rows of thin stone benches. A dry kind of sacred. This, you guess, was a working library. Not for worship, but for quiet labor. You run your fingers along one of the niches. The stone is worn smooth. You imagine scrolls once filled every slot, maybe sorted by subject, or by language. Uyghur, Sogdian, Chinese, even Sanskrit, this was a crossroads of trade and thought, after all. Mainstream scholars agree the Bezekli complex flourished between the 9th and 13th centuries, when the Silk Road was more than just a metaphor. Camels passed through here loaded with silk, jade, paper, and ideas. Merchants would stop, not just to water their animals, but to trade stories. And sometimes even leave books behind. But here's your quirky tidbit: some of the caves had specially carved book beds, low shelves set into the walls near the floor, where scrolls could rest undisturbed by drafts. One medieval traveler reportedly described the Uyghur libraries as cool as wells and quiet as breath. You find a place to sit, your back against the stone wall, the ceiling low enough that you feel cocooned. You let your mind drift to the people who came through here. Monks with calloused fingers, dusty traders arguing in 6 languages, a child too young to read, hiding under a table with a sweet cake in one hand and a scroll in the other. Historians still debate whether the caves were a strictly monastic space, or whether laypeople could access them too. Some scrolls suggest public recitations were held here, maybe during festival days, or in the cooler twilight hours when the air softened and the scent of flowering herbs drifted down from the gardens. You notice something else. The walls are angled, not sharply, but enough to suggest intention. These aren't boxy rooms, they're subtly trapezoidal, with narrow ceilings and wider bases. Why? Well, some experts believe the shape helped direct airflow, allowing warm air to rise and escape through hidden vents, while cooler air stayed lower. Others suggest it was spiritual symbolism, the narrowing ceiling like the path to enlightenment. And then there's the wind. You hear it again, outside. Whistling gently, brushing past the entrance. But in here, it's just a whisper, if that. These caves were built like tuning forks for silence. And they worked. You take a slow breath. The cool air tastes faintly metallic, like stone in spring water. You spot a broken ink pot in a corner, its glaze cracked like riverbed clay. A quill rests beside it, the feather bleached nearly white. Maybe the librarian had been interrupted mid-sentence. Or maybe the ink had dried up, and they went to the stream for more water and never came back. Time does that in places like this. Pauses become centuries. Footprints fade into the dust, and suddenly the only thing left is the quiet architecture of memory. You lie back again, eyes scanning the ceiling. There's a tiny crack shaped like a crescent moon. A wasp nest hangs in the far corner, long abandoned. Dust motes float above you, catching stray beams of light like little glimmers of thought that never quite landed. You wonder if, centuries ago, someone else lay here, asking the same quiet questions. Wondering if the words they copied would survive. If the wind would let them be. And you wonder something else: how many libraries have we lost to storms, or war, or sheer forgetfulness? And how many are still out there, waiting, patient as stone, full of words no one remembers how to read? It's a gentle kind of haunting. But not the scary kind. The good kind. The kind that just wants to be seen. You close your eyes. The wasps won't bother you. The scrolls won't mind. The wind will wait its turn. You learn how Uyghur architects angled walls and vents to tame the desert wind long before air conditioning. You stand again, brushing fine dust from your sleeves, and step deeper into the canyon. The sun's now low enough that the cliffs cast long shadows across the ground, like sleepy fingers stretching over parchment. The air cools quickly. Not cold, but comfortable. and oddly still. You start to notice things that didn't register earlier. Like how the openings to each cave aren't uniform. Some face northeast, others northwest, none directly south or west. The entrances are recessed slightly, shielded by overhangs of rock or mud brick awnings that look like natural accidents but were absolutely intentional. You squint and realize, this place was designed to outweat the wind. The desert wind in the Turpan Basin isn't just breezy. It's relentless. Hot in the day, icy at night. It can fill a room with sand in seconds, and suck moisture from your skin while you're still reaching for your canteen. So how did the Uighurs manage to store delicate scrolls and live peacefully inside stone chambers, centuries before Dyson fans and triple-glazed windows? You duck into another chamber, and this one has a surprise. A slit in the wall near the ceiling, a horizontal vent, maybe 4 inches wide, framed by smooth clay lining. You place your hand near it. A slow, steady current of air moves past your fingers. Not gusty, not dry. Just circulating. Historians refer to these as wine eyes. A kind of primitive HVAC system the Uighurs employed by studying centuries of airflow patterns in the desert canyons. The trick was balance, not stopping the wind, but inviting just the right amount in and letting it carry excess heat out. And here's the quirky bit, some chambers even had dual-level ventilation. That's right. There'd be a low slit near the floor, usually hidden behind a bench or a wall lip, and another near the ceiling. This created natural convection. Warm air rose and left, pulling cooler air in through the bottom slit. Basically, the entire library was one giant passive air conditioner designed by monks in sandals and robes, not MIT engineers. You stand in the center of the room and turn slowly. Every edge feels intentional. The floor slopes ever so slightly toward a shallow trench near the door, likely to catch and divert any sand that sneaked in. The ceiling arches upward at a gentle tilt, guiding sound softly toward the back. Nothing here echoes sharply. The walls are lined with shelves again, but these are deeper, designed to house larger scrolls or bound manuscripts. Yes, they had codices too, though scrolls were more common in earlier centuries. The shelves are carved so that their backs taper just slightly, encouraging airflow to sweep around and behind the stored documents, keeping them dry, dustless, and ideally, unmildewed. Modern architects study this kind of passive design today, and they give it flashy names like bioclimatic architecture or vernacular environmental response. The Uighurs just called it building smart. You take a seat on a broad stone ledge under a slanted wall, and lean back. Above you, a second vent lets in golden light and a hint of wind-borne cool. You stretch out and imagine lying here hundreds of years ago, wearing a woolen tunic, maybe a headscarf against the dust. Maybe you're not a monk. Maybe you're a student, learning to copy sacred texts. Or a visitor, allowed to sleep here for one night on your way to Kashgar or Samarkand. You remember the camel caravan you passed earlier in the dream, laden with dried apricots, walnut oil, and bolts of embroidered silk. One of the traders carried a book tucked in a leather satchel. A gift? A bribe? Or maybe just bedtime reading? Historians still argue whether these architectural details were learned through trial and error, or if they were passed down from earlier civilizations like the Tocharians, who once inhabited this area and also built cave sanctuaries. Some believe the Uighurs borrowed Persian engineering tricks, others insist it was all homegrown genius. The truth probably lies somewhere in the breeze between them. You close your eyes for a moment and listen. Not silence. Not exactly. You hear a low hum. The vent above you is catching just enough wind to create a soft resonance, like someone playing a single note on a bamboo flute very, very gently. It's calming. You imagine monks using these sounds to guide meditation. A subtle signal: if the wind is humming, the world is still turning. Your scroll can wait a moment longer. The breath matters more. You open your eyes again and stand. At the far end of the room, a narrow staircase winds up into the cliff wall, carved, not built. It disappears into shadow. You step forward, gently, hand brushing the smooth wall. The air thickens slightly as you climb. Warmer, heavier. But not unpleasant. At the top, you enter a small upper room. Here, the ceiling is lower, but the light streams in through a set of cleverly angled vents, like periscopes for sunbeams. The air is warm, but the breeze slips through just enough to keep it breathable. You sit once more, legs stretched out, and watch the dust dance in the beams. So many lives, so many days, so many designs went into keeping this place habitable. Not just for bodies, but for thoughts. These weren't survival shelters, they were sanctuaries for memory. And in a world that seems to forget so quickly, that kind of space feels more precious than gold. You close your eyes again. The wind continues to whisper through the stone. You discover how parchment was transported, catalogued, and preserved using clever tricks and feather dusters. As you descend the narrow staircase back into the lower chamber, the air cools again. The light fades into amber and stone blue, and your steps echo softly, just enough to remind you you're alone, but not enough to feel unwelcome. You run your hand along the wall, fingertips tracing shallow grooves. These were worn in not by tools, but by touch. Centuries of monks, scribes, and travelers brushing past just like you. You duck into a different side room. The ceiling's lower here, the floor lined with a patchwork of woven mats. In one corner, what looks like a pile of travel satchels, faded and tattered, some patched with scraps of hide or silk. A few scroll tubes still poke out, long, thin cylinders made of lacquered wood, capped with cloth stoppers. These were the mail carriers of the desert world. You kneel down and pick one up. The wood is surprisingly light, the stopper wrapped in a scrap of embroidered cloth. Inside, a faint scent of old ink, dry grasses, and something musky, like cedar that's forgotten how to be a tree. Transporting parchment and paper across the desert was a balancing act of brilliance and absurdity. You needed to keep scrolls dry, cool, and clean. But camels don't care about your archival standards. They care about not being poked in the side with sharp corners or having your manuscript case slip off mid-dune. So the Uighurs developed methods, some smart, some just creative. For one, they wrapped their scrolls not just in cloth, but in layered reeds soaked in vinegar and herbs. This served two purposes. First, it discouraged insects. Apparently, the desert's moths and beetles didn't care for the sour tang of sage vinegar wrap. Second, it added just enough padding to prevent scrolls from cracking during travel. But the real showstopper? Feather dusters. You're not kidding. Sitting on a nearby ledge is one, still intact. The feathers are long, striped, and delicately tied to a carved reed handle. Likely goose feathers, though it's possible they used crane or duck depending on availability. These weren't decorative. They were tools. Scrolls had to be dusted regularly. Even in a sealed cave, fine sand would find its way in. Dust wasn't just inconvenient, it was corrosive. It wore down ink, weakened fibers, and invited mold if left unchecked. So every librarian, in addition to their ink pot and stylus, had a feather duster nearby. It was like having a vacuum cleaner in your satchel, just quieter and fluffier. You settle onto one of the mats and imagine the process. A caravan arrives. The scrolls are unpacked. Each one is checked, unwrapped, carefully dusted with long gentle strokes, then catalogued. Not with Dewey Decimal, of course, but with a mix of painted symbols and string codes. Yes, string. Some Uyghur libraries used knotted strings tied to scroll ends to indicate subject matter, language, and date. A red knot meant religious texts. A white knot, poetry. Double knots for foreign scripts. It was an elegant, low-tech system, imperfect, but way better than blindly guessing. Historians still argue whether this method came from Indian manuscript traditions or was a local innovation. Either way, it worked. You notice a small stack of clay tablets in the corner. About palm-sized, each with neat impressions, not cuneiform, but not decorative either. Possibly inventory records. It wasn't uncommon for monks to keep duplicates of library indexes on more durable surfaces in case a scroll was lost, stolen, or eaten by a particularly enthusiastic goat. And here's a quirky tidbit: one 12th century Uyghur note scratched onto a wall fragment now stored in a museum in Berlin reads something like, "Returned with 3 scrolls, 1 water damaged, none my fault." So even back then, library returns were a drama. You lie back on the mat. The ceiling above you is low and perfectly smooth. No frescoes here. Just blank stone. A working room. A place of dusting, sorting, packing, reading. Somewhere between a study and a stable. You imagine the rustle of scrolls being opened. The soft sound of cloth being unwrapped. The swish of a feather duster. Maybe a quiet cough, or the scrape of a quill across paper. The scrolls themselves were often made of Uyghur paper, a mix of mulberry bark, tamarisk pulp, and sometimes even hemp or cotton rags. Light, flexible, and surprisingly durable. The ink? Usually carbon-based, mixed with plant gums. Some high-quality scrolls included powdered silver or gold for headings. But even with the best materials, nothing lasted without care. So the Uyghurs cared. Care was a daily discipline. Dusting, rotating scrolls, checking for mold or fraying threads. Repairs were done with glue made from fish bladders or boiled hooves, less gross than it sounds. Mostly. You wonder how many hands passed over these scrolls. How many stories were carried in and out on camelback, never to return. And how many still wait in deep storage rooms, unread for centuries. Some of the scrolls you pass are still bundled tight. Others are cracked open slightly, showing dark ink on pale parchment. You spot one with an illustration, simple, but expressive. A monk seated beneath a tree, eyes closed, mouth open, possibly snoring. Above him, a fox watches with visible judgment. It's good to know even in sacred texts, naps were accepted. You sit there, feather duster in hand, surrounded by layers of parchment, patience, and pre-modern logistics. It's a strange feeling. Like the room is breathing, just faintly. Like the scrolls are resting, not forgotten. And maybe you are too. You yawn without meaning to. The mat beneath you shifts slightly as your weight settles. The dust motes spiral lazily overhead, drifting down like ancient snow. The wind outside stirs, but in here, everything holds. The archives had sentinels, not just monks but thick curtains, gravel pits, and gecko-eating cats. You stretch your legs out, rising slowly from the mat as your back gives a quiet pop, an ancient scroll of its own. The feather duster in your hand feels oddly like a baton, like you've inherited some kind of sacred duty. You set it down gently, like tucking in a sleepy thought, and step back into the corridor. The air shifts again. A gentle coolness lingers low to the ground, while warmer air grazes the top of your shoulders. Somewhere above, a draft hums through a vent with the rhythm of a distant kettle. You move into another chamber, this one deeper and darker. The stone walls here are heavier, almost claustrophobic, and you notice something odd right away, a shallow trench around the perimeter of the floor, filled with what looks like pebbles? Not decoration. This was part of the gravel trap, an ancient form of insulation and defense. The gravel helped in 3 ways. First, it collected and dampened any sand that slipped in through the doorway. Second, it acted as a barrier to insects. And third, it muffled footsteps, making it easier to hear if someone or something was wandering the library after hours. And then there were the curtains. Yes, curtains. Heavy ones, stitched from yak wool or thick felt, dyed in earthy reds or ochres. You pass one now, parted slightly, but still swinging a little from your presence. These curtains weren't for show. They sealed off entrances like airlocks, keeping the dry wind and drifting grit outside where it belonged. Some were even double-layered, with small clay weights stitched into the bottom hem to keep them from flapping. You push through one slowly, and find yourself in a room that smells different. Musky, sweet, a little wild. And there, curled lazily in the corner, beneath a scroll rack, is a statue of a cat. Well, it looks like a statue. But as you approach, its ears twitch. It blinks once, then stretches a long, luxurious sprawl that ends in a yawn so wide you can count every one of its sharp little teeth. The feline stares at you with what can only be described as bored suspicion. Meet the archive guardian. Cats were more than companions here. They were pest control, protectors of parchment, and possibly spiritual mascots depending on who you asked. Desert libraries had enemies: silverfish, beetles, booklice, and the occasional robe lizard. The worst offenders? Geckos. Cute to us, disastrous to them. Geckos were known to nest in warm nooks behind scrolls and even nibble on blue bindings. So the monks kept cats. Not just any cats, semi-feral, grain-fed, gecko-hunting acrobats that were treated like minor nobility. They came and went as they pleased. They slept wherever they wanted. And yes, they sometimes curled up on top of the most sacred manuscripts. Because of course they did. In one 11th century traveler's account, a Uighur monk reportedly said, "We trust the cats more than the apprentices. At least the cats don't copy scripture backwards." Which is both adorable and reasonable. You squat beside this one, who's now watching you with one paw raised mid-groom. You offer a hand. The cat sniffs it, then ignores you entirely and resumes licking its side like you are categorically beneath its notice. That's fair. You step over the cat and look around. This chamber is lower ceilinged but more carefully arranged. The scrolls here are bundled tighter. The air smells faintly of mint and citrus peel, likely part of an old pest repellent mix they used. Some bundles are wrapped in waxed linen, others tied with red cords. You notice one with tiny bite marks along the edge. Someone lost a battle. Historians still argue whether the cats were bred intentionally by the monks or just gradually adopted into library culture. Some records suggest kittens were gifted by traveling dignitaries. Others say they were caught as strays and earned their keep one gecko at a time. One even claims the cats were read to as a form of training, which, frankly, sounds like wishful thinking. Still, the partnership worked. You trace a paw print on the dusty floor. It crosses a pattern of footprints, bare human ones, intersecting, overlapping. The ghost of daily life left in dust. And that's the thing about these archives. They weren't sterile vaults. They were living spaces. Quiet, yes. Sacred, definitely. but also places where people joked, scratched their noses, chased bugs with slippers, and snuck snacks between copying stanzas. You walk slowly now, following a narrow passage that opens into a small courtyard, yes, a courtyard, carved open to the sky. Here, wind is allowed in, but only in spirals. The walls around you are curved to bounce air up, not through, and the floor is laid with gravel and sun-baked clay tiles. This is where monks brought particularly dusty scrolls to shake out gently in the breeze. It's also, according to one translated inscription, where the cats received their offerings. Bits of dried fish, leftover millet, sometimes just a clean bowl of water. You look up and see a tiny stone shelf tucked into the wall, just the right size for a curl-up cat and a bowl. It's adorable. And completely practical. You sit on a warm stone bench and let the sun press gently on your shoulders. The wind curls around you like a silk scarf present, but never pushy. Around you, the archives are quiet again. But not empty. Cats still patrol. Curtains still sway. Gravel still crunches under careful feet. You breathe in, long and slow. In a world full of noise, the Uighurs built quiet fortresses. They tamed wind with angles, fought insects with herbs, and trusted in scrolls, silence, and maybe a few well-fed felines. You smile a little. This isn't a place built to impress. It's a place built to endure. Sit beside a calligrapher copying Buddhist sutras while sipping yak butter tea and grumbling about flies. You pass through another weighted curtain, this one dyed a deep turmeric yellow, and enter a room with a different energy. Less solemn. Less guarded. There's a sense of movement here, like the space is alive even in its stillness. And in the corner, cross-legged on a low stool, is a figure hunched over a narrow wooden desk. He doesn't look up at you. Not yet. His quill moves with deliberate grace, sweeping upward in tall, curved strokes, then snapping downward into precise points. His back is a gentle curve. His robe, a faded brown, pulls around him like a shadow. This is a calligrapher. A scribe dedicated to the sacred act of copying Buddhist sutras, one character at a time, with the kind of attention usually reserved for bomb defusal or baking macarons in a high-humidity kitchen. You sit quietly beside him on a woven cushion that crackles faintly under your weight. The desk between you both is surprisingly small, but every inch of it is sacred. To the right, an inkstone and brush rest like sleeping tools. To the left, a cup of something steaming gently. He finally looks up. Without speaking, he gestures toward the cup. It's yak butter tea, a desert staple. It smells like someone melted a stick of butter into a smoky soup and then dared you to enjoy it. You lift the cup cautiously. The first sip is warm, oily, and shockingly comforting. Salty, too. Like tea had a secret career in soup broths and only now decided to come clean. The calligrapher watches you from the corner of his eye and lets out a single, dry chuckle. Then, he swats at something. A fly. Of course. You hear the soft slap of his palm against the wooden desk. He misses. The fly, undeterred, loops lazily through the room. The calligrapher mutters something under his breath that's definitely not in the sutra. You sit still and try not to smile. Flies in the desert are more than an annoyance, they're persistent little gatecrashers that thrive in warmth, shadow, and human breath. In these libraries, they were enemy number 2, right behind sand and slightly ahead of humidity. The monks had dozens of tactics to drive them off. Some burned bundles of dried herbs. Others dangled ropes soaked in vinegar. One particularly creative monk once smeared marmot grease around windows to confuse their scent trails, though historians still debate whether that was pest control or an early prank. You watch the calligrapher resume his work. His brush dances again, gentle arcs, delicate flourishes. He's copying a portion of the Lotus Sutra, one of the most widely read Mahayana texts. Each character is laid down like a seed, planted in perfect rows, nurtured with the patience of someone who knows they might not live to see the harvest. It's a rhythm: dip, tap, stroke. Pause. Breathe. Swatted fly. Repeat. And here's your historical anchor. Uyghur script, evolved from the Sogdian script, is written vertically, top to bottom, in a fluid, graceful style that looks more like grass in the wind than rigid lines. It was designed to be read slowly, meditatively. Each character not just a symbol, but a breath. Quirky detail? Some Uyghur scribes were trained to chant as they wrote, murmuring the words softly under their breath to maintain rhythm and ensure spiritual alignment. Not required, but considered good practice. Imagine an ancient ASMR performance, with incense smoke, brush strokes, and the occasional curse word mumbled at a fly. The calligrapher finishes a line and lifts the brush. He holds it over the inkstone for a moment, considering. And then, with a soft sigh, rests it across a carved holder. He leans back, stretches his arms overhead, and looks at you. Finally. He doesn't speak, but nods toward a low table behind you. There, on a rough tray, sits a bowl of something yellow and lumpy. You look closer. It's dried apricot mash, mixed with crushed walnuts and a hint of desert honey. A scribe's snack. Rich, energy-dense, and sticky enough to bind together your next 3 thoughts. You pick up a small bite. It's sweet, soft, and just slightly gritty, like memory preserved in pulp. The scribe smiles. Then he gestures to the scroll before him, as if to say, "Want to try?" You hesitate. But curiosity wins. You take the brush in hand, he adjusts your grip, and dip it into the ink. It's thicker than you expect. Smells faintly of burnt pine and age. You bring it to the parchment and, very carefully, trace the next character. It wobbles. Looks a bit like a bird that lost an argument with gravity. But the scribe nods with solemn approval, as if to say, "Not bad for your first 1,000 years." Historians still argue whether the calligraphy chambers were purely utilitarian or served a meditative purpose. Some scrolls reference dreams had while copying sutras, visions of distant lands, talking animals, or clouds shaped like deities. Others simply complain about ink shortages, aching knees, and how Tashi keeps borrowing my brush and never puts it back. You set the brush down and exhale. The room is warm, still. The fly has disappeared, maybe outsmarted by incense smoke curling from a tiny burner in the corner. The calligrapher turns back to his work, and you sit quietly, watching. The words flow again. The tea cools. The apricot mash settles in your belly. The scroll lengthens, thought by thought. And you, for a moment, are part of its story. Explore the silent rules of a Uyghur reading room where even sneezing got you side-eye from a lama. You stretch again, rising gently from your cushion, trying not to disturb the scribe's steady rhythm. He barely notices. His world is measured in ink drops and brush strokes. You step softly across the mat and slip through another wool-curtained archway into a new chamber, one quieter than the rest. Much quieter. This is the reading room. At first glance, it's nothing elaborate. Low shelves run along the walls, each stacked with neatly bound scrolls or tightly wrapped codices. There are no chairs. Just floor cushions placed at precise intervals. The light here comes from small openings high on the eastern wall angled to catch the sunrise and fade by noon. The air feels dense with respect. Not fear. Not pressure. Just a kind of collective reverence, like walking into a room where everyone is listening to something very small, very sacred. You step forward, and the soft crunch of your sandal on a reed mat makes you freeze. No one else is here, but you instinctively glance around as though a librarian llama might leap from the shadows and shush you into oblivion. Because yes, there were rules. Not posted on signs, of course. Not barked by guards. These rules were taught quietly, passed on through gesture and raised eyebrows, practiced until they became instinct. You break one, and you'll know immediately. Not because someone says anything, but because the atmosphere will shift, ever so slightly, like you just knocked over a vase in a cathedral. Let's go over a few. Rule 1: no sandals in the reading area. Too dusty, too noisy. You notice a stack of them near the doorway, neatly placed like dozing beetles. You slip yours off and proceed barefoot. The mats beneath your feet are warm and slightly uneven, softened by years of sitting, reading, existing. Rule 2: no loud breathing. You chuckle at that, quietly. But it's true. The monks practiced breath control not just for meditation, but because heavy breathing disturbed others. You take a slow inhale through your nose. The room smells faintly of paper, pressed herbs, and beeswax. Rule 3: no sneezing. Not because they thought it spread demons, though that was definitely a fringe theory, but because it broke concentration. In one scroll, a monk recorded his irritation at the novice who sneezed thrice and ruined the rhythm of my enlightenment. Harsh, but understandable. If you absolutely had to sneeze, the correct procedure was to retreat quickly into the vestibule, sneeze into your sleeve, and return only once the breeze of noise had passed. Rule 4: no spontaneous discussion. Questions were allowed, encouraged, even, but only in hushed tones, and only at designated times. For urgent clarifications, students would write questions on slates and pass them forward like medieval classroom notes. Historians agree that Uyghur learning spaces were both structured and unusually gentle. Punishment was rare. Correction came in the form of silence, of being ignored for a few days, or of being assigned the scroll-copying equivalent of peeling potatoes, transcribing temple maintenance records in triplicate. You step further into the room and notice something beautiful. Each cushion is placed beneath a small inscription carved into the wall. Some are quotations from Buddhist texts. Others are just reminders. One reads, "Let the words settle like dust, do not chase them." Another says, "Breathe once for the writer, once for the reader, once for yourself." Quirky detail? Some cushions had personalized pressure stones, small, flat stones wrapped in cloth, placed behind the back to encourage upright posture. Scholars believe that slouching led to both poor reading comprehension and bad karma. Which, honestly, might still be true. You sit down on one such cushion. The pressure stone nudges your lower spine gently, reminding you to straighten. Your back thanks it. You reach forward and pull a scroll from the nearest niche. It's tied with a pale blue ribbon, soft with age. You undo the knot slowly, like unwrapping a fragile memory. The scroll unfurls easily, its parchment surprisingly supple. The characters swim before your eyes, flowing down the page like a river of thought. You can't read them, not fluently, but you recognize some shapes from the scribe's work earlier. This looks like a commentary text, margins filled with tiny notations in faded red ink. You imagine the reader who sat here before you. Maybe a teenage apprentice, nervously preparing for a recitation. Or a weathered monk reviewing a lesson plan. Or a weary traveler, grateful for a cool place to rest and learn something new. Historians still debate whether these reading rooms were used solely by the monastery or shared with the broader community. Some scholars argue that traveling merchants were granted brief access, especially those who could offer texts or stories in return. Others believe the libraries were cloistered, a protected knowledge bank accessible only to the spiritually vetted. Your guess? A bit of both. After all, desert wisdom is like water, best when shared, but always carried carefully. You keep reading. The scroll's texture feels almost alive under your fingertips. Slightly ribbed, faintly warm. You reach the end and begin rolling it up again, thumb smoothing the edges, folding the past back into place. The ribbon slips between your fingers, and you tie it back as neatly as you can. You sit for a moment longer, simply breathing. The wind doesn't reach this far. The silence is complete, but never lonely. Then, from somewhere above, a soft creak. Not sharp. Just a ceiling beam stretching its old bones in the afternoon light. You smile. Even buildings need to exhale sometimes. You rise, carefully return the scroll to its niche, and step away. You don't speak. You don't need to. The scrolls remember you. Meet the real pests of desert libraries and the fermented horse milk they used to drive them off. You step softly into another chamber, this one darker and cooler than the rest. The air feels heavier, almost damp, which in the desert is both a luxury and a warning. You run your hand along the wall and feel the faint trace of condensation, not from water, but from time. This room has held moisture for centuries, and with it, secrets and pests. Because no matter how clever the Uighurs were with airflow and curtain design, they were still at war with the tiniest of invaders. You move closer to a low shelf lined with aged scrolls bundled in thick cotton wrappings. But something else catches your eye: small holes in the shelf wood. Tiny, round, almost uniform. The signature of the dreaded bookworm. Okay, not technically worms, most of them were larvae of beetles or moths. But bookworm sounds cuter than paper-chewing mandible nightmare. And these little nuisances were the bane of librarians from China to Constantinople. The dry heat of the desert slowed them down, but the occasional humidity pocket, like the one in this very room, gave them just enough of an opening. So what did the Uighurs do about it? Enter the fermented horse milk. You spot a small clay jar in the corner, corked and sealed with wax. Next to it, a brush made from coarse bristles and what might be goat hair. This was one of the more eccentric pest control methods used by the desert monks. Kymyz, a fermented mare's milk still popular across Central Asia today, was brushed around shelves and entryways to deter insects. Why? Scholars speculate it had to do with the combination of alcohol, acidity, and smell. Kymyz is sharply tangy, fizzy, slightly sour, and to a bookworm, it's basically a big glowing exit sign. Bonus, it mildly disinfected the area and discouraged the growth of mold. Though, yes, your library occasionally smelled like sour yogurt and barnyard funk. You kneel down to inspect another shelf. A pile of scroll fragments rests in a corner, torn, bitten, partially eaten. You spot the lacy signature of silverfish trails, those tiny, squiggly lines etched into the surface of ancient pages like some insect Jackson Pollock got loose with a nib. To counter these pests, the monks turned to natural repellents, bundles of dried herbs, crushed citrus peels, cedarwood chips, and even ground-up garlic mixed with water and sprayed on the ground. Sometimes they burned the herbs to fumigate the room, a risky but effective method that occasionally led to complaints like too much smoke, not enough chanting. Here's your quirky tidbit: some scrolls were deliberately wrapped in horsehair cloth, not just for durability, but because certain pests didn't like the texture. There's even one surviving note that recommends sprinkling a powder of burnt hoof and salt around storage rooms to confuse the crawling ones. You chuckle quietly. The lengths to which people will go to protect their books is kind of beautiful. Then, you see movement. A flicker near the wall. You inch closer, and there, clinging to the upper corner of the shelf, is a house gecko, tail twitching. Eyes alert, body nearly translucent. It stares at you with the cool judgment of a creature that's seen things. And probably eaten them. Geckos were both part of the problem and part of the solution. While they did occasionally nest behind scrolls and leave droppings in unfortunate places, they were also avid predators of silverfish, moths, and other pests. So the relationship was complicated. Some monks shooed them out. Others encouraged them to stay. A few even named them. There's a line in a 13th century Uyghur text that reads, "Let Pakshi remain near the scriptures, for he eats what does not belong." Pakshi, by the way, may have been a gecko, or a small dog. Historians still argue. Because of course they do. You rise and wander to a small alcove lined with jars and bowls, the pest lab, if you will. You pick up a tiny ceramic dish containing what looks like gray powder. A note beside it, written in faint script, says something like, "Ash of elder bark, to be stirred with vinegar and used for corners." You dip your finger in and sniff cautiously. It smells vaguely like fireplace and pickles. Definitely bug-off approved. Back near the doorway, another jar sits cracked open. You peer in and see dried leaves, possibly mint or wormwood. It was common to stuff scroll wrappings with dried herbs to discourage nesting. Bonus, the scrolls smelled better. A mild counter to the fermented milk fumes drifting from time to time. You sit cross-legged again, brushing a few crumbs from the mat. Around you, the silence is interrupted only by the occasional skitter of gecko claws and the distant sigh of wind. You think about modern libraries with climate control, barcode systems, and plastic sleeves. And then you look around at what the Uighurs achieved here: a self-regulating sanctuary, protected by scent, sound, and a rotating cast of determined creatures. It's strangely comforting to know that even in a place of high learning, people had to deal with the same everyday nonsense: pests, smells, weird homemade sprays that half worked and half annoyed everyone. You reach for a scroll nearby. One wrapped in multiple layers, clearly well loved, and unroll it slowly. There are faint teeth marks along one edge, but the text inside is still legible. Preserved. Fought for. Respected. You lean back against the cool stone, smiling. Even in a desert, knowledge needs guardians. Sometimes they're monks. Sometimes they're cats. And sometimes, they're fermented horse milk in a jar that smells like betrayal. Unravel the blend of mulberry bark, poplar sap, and mondel patience that kept manuscripts alive for centuries. You stretch your legs, stand slowly, and give one last respectful glance to the gecko before stepping out of the pest chamber, grateful, in a strange way, that even the bugs had a part in the story. You walk down a gentle slope in the stone, where the walls widen and open into a workroom flooded with dappled morning light. This room smells different. Not musty. Not smoky. Fresh. You inhale deeply and catch hints of plant resin, damp wood, and something sweet, almost floral. The scent of paper in the making. Because here, in this sun-warmed hollow, the monks didn't just read or copy scrolls. They made them. Stacks of what look like flat wooden screens lean against one wall. To your left, a shallow basin lined with linen sits quietly beneath a trickle of spring water. And all around you, neatly arranged in bowls, jars, and baskets, are the ingredients of one of the desert's most improbable miracles: paper that lasted centuries. Start with the basics. The Uighurs, like many across Central Asia, made paper from mulberry bark, specifically from the inner fibers, which were soaked, beaten into pulp, and mixed with clean water. Mulberry was strong, flexible, and abundant. A perfect choice for the dry climate. But they didn't stop there. You step over to a low table and find a bundle of dried poplar leaves, still aromatic. The poplar tree, common in the nearby Darim River basin, provided sap and tannins that were blended into the paper mixture to add strength and flexibility. The sap gave the sheets a faint gloss and a resilience to humidity shifts. A scroll made with it could be rolled and unrolled for decades without flaking. You lift a piece of dried bark and run your thumb along the fibrous edge. It's coarse, yes. But you can already see how, with water and patience, it would become something smooth, something refined. Now, here's the quirky twist: in some scrolls, the paper contains traces of animal hair and rice starch, suggesting the monks experimented constantly, tailoring each batch based on the climate, the purpose of the scroll, or even the mood of the season. There's even mention in a monastery log of a rain batch. A special paper recipe made only during storms, believed to be more spiritually potent because it absorbed the sky's sorrow. And what held it all together? Mongol patience. No, really. During the Mongol period, especially in the 13th century, the Uyghur region saw a blending of traditions. Under Mongol rule, Uyghurs weren't just tolerated, they were respected as scribes, translators, and scholars. With that came a spread of technique. Patience wasn't a virtue, it was a production requirement. The pulp had to settle. The sheets had to cure. Some monks let them dry in moonlight to avoid cracking under the sun. Historians still argue whether these paper recipes were unique to the Uyghurs or adapted from Chinese or Persian traditions. The truth is probably a beautiful mess of borrowed ideas and local genius. What's undeniable is the result: manuscripts that have survived earthquakes, empires, and more than one overly enthusiastic archaeologist. You kneel near the basin. A sheet of wet pulp rests on the screen, fibers layered like clouds in a stormy sky. You imagine the process: scoop, shake, press. Let the water drain, then peel the sheet gently and dry it on a warm stone wall. Nearby, a shelf holds dried sheets, now creamy white with a soft texture almost like parchment, but with the warmth of something grown, not scraped. Some are already marked with faint lines, guides for the calligrapher's brush. Others are blank, full of potential. You pick up one and hold it to the light. It's thin, but strong. A whisper of a page. And yet, this is what held the thoughts of emperors, poets, and dusty scribes who grumbled about tea quality and still managed to translate the Diamond Sutra before breakfast. You place it back gently and walk to another corner, where ink sticks are drying. They're made from soot, pine resin, and animal glue, shaped into rectangular blocks with tiny inscriptions on the side. One reads, "May the words endure." Another says, "Steady hand, calm breath." It's poetic. Also practical. These ink sticks could last for years, ground against stone with a splash of water to make fresh ink daily. There's something humble about it all. No machines. No glowing screens. Just fiber, time, and quiet focus. And yet these tools produce texts that crossed centuries, that still whisper when unrolled. You think again of all the things that don't last: email passwords, plastic packaging, last week's shopping list. And feel a sudden awe for this sheet of paper, made by monks with buckets and patience. You sit on a cushion, hold a blank page in your lap, and run your palm over it. Smooth. Honest. Waiting. Not every page needs to hold a masterpiece. But every page deserves care. The Uighurs understood that. They didn't just record knowledge. They crafted the very stage upon which thought would perform. And you? You're just lucky enough to be here. The wind outside rises again. Not loud, but insistent. A reminder of what presses in, always. And what, somehow, still holds. From brass scroll weights to bat-done ink, discover what Uyghur scholars carried into their daily grind. You rise from the cushion and brush a stray poplar leaf from your lap. The blank sheet of handmade paper still lingers in your thoughts, the way it held nothing and yet seemed to carry everything. You step into a narrower corridor now, carved deeper into the rock, where the air grows stiller, more focused. The walls here are plain, functional, undecorated. Practical. This was no temple. This was a tool room. You spot a long wooden shelf lined with items that, at first glance, resemble forgotten kitchen utensils. But look closer. Each object is part of the scholar's daily ritual. Here lie the quiet weapons of learning: brushes, stones, bottles, cords, weights, and yes, more feather dusters. You pick up a small brass scroll weight. It's smooth and cool to the touch, about the size of your palm, engraved with a looping floral pattern and a tiny inscription that simply reads, "Stillness." These weights were essential. In desert winds or even a drafty cave, scrolls could curl annoyingly while you were reading or writing. Scholars would place one on either end to hold their parchment steady, creating a personal oasis of calm in a world full of swirls. You set it down gently and reach for a brush. This one's handle is carved from bone, perhaps yak or deer, with soft bristles stained with years of ink. Uyghur scholars favored a brush style imported from Tang, China, known for its balance between flexibility and control. A good brush wasn't flashy. It responded to your breath, your posture, your lunch. It was, as one text puts it, a mirror for the spirit. Next to the brushes is a row of ink bottles, each made of ceramic or rough-cut stone. You open one and recoil slightly. The smell hits you before you can even guess what it is. Bat dung. Yes. You heard that right. The Uyghurs, along with many in Central Asia, sometimes used bat guano in their ink making. Why? High nitrate content. Mixed with carbon and binders like tree gum or fish glue, it produced an intense, permanent black ideal for texts meant to survive centuries. One monk's note recommends collecting guano from the quiet end of the caves, where the bats are most undisturbed and therefore spiritually balanced. Apparently, even their ink ingredients had to be centered. Quirky fact of the day? Some scholars insisted that morning collected dung had better energy than evening batches. Historians still argue whether this was actual chemistry or just a result of whoever had to do the collection being extremely grumpy by dusk. You move on and find a row of wax tablets, used for taking temporary notes or doing math problems. They're smooth and faintly sticky from centuries of handling. You picture a young novice practicing his scroll layout, wiping it off repeatedly with the heel of his hand before committing anything to paper. Beside the tablets is a spool of red thread, used to bind temporary bundles of scrolls or attach tags for categorization. One text notes a color system: red for religious works, blue for poetry, green for medicine, and yellow for foreign texts. It wasn't universal, but in some libraries, this thread was as good as a label. You spot a water flask, made from horn and wrapped in what looks like dyed linen. The cork is still in place, sealed with beeswax. Water was always nearby, not just for drinking, but for preparing ink, softening paper edges, or simply calming dry hands mid-scribing. Then there's the tea kit. You can't mistake it: a small brass burner, a stone cup stained with butter, and a sack of dried tea leaves. Uyghur scholars drank tea like it was both caffeine and communion. It wasn't uncommon for scribes to take breaks, sip yak butter tea, and recite verses aloud while warming their hands over the tiny flame. Some even brewed their tea using snowmelt stored in ceramic jars, believing it had better spiritual clarity than spring water. You take a seat on a wooden bench tucked into the wall, surrounded by these tools. For a moment, the centuries collapse. You're not just visiting anymore, you're part of the rhythm. Dip the brush. Tap the stone. Roll the scroll. Place the weight. Inhale. Write. Some of the tools show wear. A chip on the edge of the inkstone. A frayed brush handle. But none of them are discarded. The monks believed that objects absorb knowledge, and thus should be treated with respect even after breaking. A cracked brush could become a page-turner. A worn weight, a doorstop for a meditation room. Nothing was wasted. Everything had purpose, even the imperfections. Historians still discuss whether this approach was purely practical or rooted in Buddhist teachings about attachment and reincarnation. Maybe both. Either way, it meant that tools weren't just things. They were companions on the path to insight. You look around and realize something funny. There are no locks. No chests. No signs that these objects were ever hidden or hoarded. Because here, the greatest security wasn't a bolt. It was trust. That anyone using these tools would understand their worth and treat them with the reverence they deserved. You lean back, arms draped over your knees, and stare at the stone ceiling. You picture a day here, rising with the sun, stretching under the call of a desert bird, choosing your brush like a sword, brewing tea beside a gecko on a windowsill. No rush. Just rhythm. Just learning. And at the center of it all, these humble, powerful objects. Tools that didn't just help scholars work, but helped them think. Tour the library's hypnotic ventilation shafts designed to whistle knowledge straight into your brain, almost. You rise from the bench, shoulders loose, breath steady. The scent of tea, old ink, and yes, a trace of bat dung lingers like a subtle perfume from another life. The air shifts again, and your ears pick up something unexpected, a hum. Faint, airy. A sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. You follow it, stepping through a narrow corridor that twists like a lazy river. The stone underfoot is smoother here, worn into a gentle slope. As you walk, the hum grows louder, modulating slightly as if carried through a giant flute. And then you arrive. It's not a room, not really. More like a vertical shaft, open from floor to ceiling, roughly cylindrical and carved straight through the rock. Slats and curves spiral upward, framing slits of light and invisible breezes that seem to come and go like wandering spirits. A stone bench curves around the base like an amphitheater seat in a very quiet opera house. You sit. The sound is mesmerizing, wind funneled through carefully angled slits and ducts, vibrating in precisely tuned patterns. The shaft catches the breeze from above, filters it downward through small resonating chambers, and releases it into the room as a low, hollow tone that never quite becomes a song, but always teases at one. Uyghur engineers didn't just design for airflow, they designed for acoustics. These ventilation shafts weren't accidental gaps. They were architectural lullabies. The goal was not merely to circulate air, but to create an environment that encouraged reflection. Quirky bit? Some scholars believe the shafts were deliberately tuned. The angles of the side vents, the diameter of the opening, even the depth of the chamber below, all working together to create harmonic tones. Not music. Not exactly. But something deeply peaceful. A tone just shy of thought. One 12th century scroll even includes a short poem, where the wind curves low, let your thoughts rise high. Where the whisper lingers, listen with your bones. Yeah. It's that kind of place. The room itself was likely used for meditation or study breaks, what the monks called listening posture. You weren't expected to read here. You were expected to absorb. Sit. Breathe. Let the wind think for a while. And here's the fun fringe debate. Historians still argue whether some monks believed that the wind carried divine inspiration. Not metaphorically, but literally, that the harmonic vibrations could help align the mind for better memory, clearer thought, even visions. There's no scientific proof, of course, but if you've ever sat in a room and felt your entire body relax because of the way it sounds, you'll understand. You shift on the bench, now noticing how the stone curves support your lower back perfectly. Another design trick. The monks knew how to build for breath. The shaft pulls warm air up and away, creating a natural downdraft. The result? Cool air settles around your feet, even in the heat of day. Your hands rest loosely in your lap. The hum changes slightly deeper now. Like a slow exhale from a sleeping god. You close your eyes. It's not silence. It's tuned stillness. There's a legend, probably more myth than fact, about a Uyghur monk who meditated in one of these chambers for so long, his heartbeat aligned with the wind. They say he became so still, birds nested on his shoulders. Probably poetic exaggeration. Probably. Still, it's nice to imagine. Around you, the tones shift again. A higher breeze cuts through from an upper shaft. The pitch softens, like a question being asked gently, then fading before the answer arrives. You think of all the places you've sat with noise. Cafes, buses, offices, rooms where the hum of appliances fills your thoughts with cotton. But here, in a cave carved by people who listened harder than most people ever speak, the noise feels like wisdom. You open your eyes slowly. The stone catches light now. Amber lines where the sun is filtering through angled vents. The light dances as the wind shifts, as if the whole room were breathing in time with the desert outside. You rise again, but slower this time. The floor tilts just slightly upward, guiding you gently back into the larger hall. You glance once more at the shaft, still humming faintly, still whispering songs no one wrote. You smile. Because somewhere, deep in your chest, a part of you is now humming too. Historians still argue whether Western archaeologists preserved or pilfered the buried treasure of these libraries. You step back into the larger cave system now, leaving behind the melodic wind chamber, your footsteps slightly echoing against the smooth floor. The hum fades as you move into a part of the library that feels heavier. Not physically, but emotionally. The air is cooler, yes, but there's a tension to it. Like entering a room where something has been taken, but never quite replaced. This chamber is emptier than the others. Some scroll racks still stand, but most are bare. You see the faint outlines of where manuscripts once rested, shadowy rectangles dusted in lighter stone. Like ghosts of knowledge. A small plaque near the entrance, carved in several scripts, notes the original capacity of this room, over 300 scrolls. There are maybe 10 left now. You walk slowly, taking in the silence. It's not just the absence of voices or wind. It's the silence of absence itself. Of something removed. Because in the early 20th century, European explorers began arriving here, notebooks and rucksacks in hand, eyes wide with discovery. They were archaeologists, historians, linguists, adventurers, and, depending on who you ask, salvagers or looters. Names like Oral Stein and Albert von Lecoq echo through the records. They traveled through the Taklamakan and beyond, documenting ancient sites, photographing murals, cataloging manuscripts. And here's the complicated part, taking thousands of them home. To museums in London, in Berlin, in St. Petersburg, in Tokyo. Some argue they saved these materials from certain destruction. That without these expeditions, the scrolls would have crumbled in caves, lost to earthquakes, bandits, or neglect. And there's merit to that. But others point out the sheer volume of what was removed. The murals sliced from cave walls. The boxes of manuscripts hauled away without local consent. The fact that some scrolls were traded, sold, or simply borrowed indefinitely. You sit on a bench, just stone now, no cushion, and rest your hands on your knees. It's hard not to feel the weight of it. Imagine pouring your life into writing a single scroll. The long hours. The careful lines. The whispered prayers. And then, centuries later, a stranger arrives. He marvels, he praises, and he leaves with it under his arm. Quirky fact? Von Lecoq once wrote home to his patron that he had to cut the paintings off the walls carefully, as they were fragile and splendid. Yes, he used the word splendid. Almost like complimenting the goose while cooking it. Some scholars now work to digitize these works, to make the scrolls available online, to return, if not the physical object, at least the knowledge. And that matters. But a screen is not stone. A PDF is not parchment. You can't run your fingers over it and feel the monk's breath beneath the ink. You walk to a far corner of the chamber, where a small alcove holds the fragments that remained, scrolls too fragile to move, too brittle to lift. These were the survivors. Not because they were chosen, but because they were forgotten. There's a quiet kind of power in that. You kneel beside one. The parchment is cracked, its writing faded into a whisper. But it's still here. Still holding its place. You wonder how many more scrolls are still hidden? In caves too dangerous to enter? In storerooms lost beneath sand? How many texts lie buried, unknown, because no one knew to look? Historians still argue about ownership. Who really owns an ancient scroll? The people who made it? The nation it was found in? The museum that holds it? The world? But here, in the soft hush of the chamber, the scroll doesn't argue. It just waits. It's not angry. It's not grieving. It's just here. You reach out and gently, very gently, trace the edge of the stone niche. Dust coats your fingers. A small gecko skitters along the wall and disappears into a crack. The silence remains. And you realize this is a room for questions more than answers. What happens when knowledge is taken? When memory is relocated? When a scroll travels halfway around the world, rolled tightly in a crate beside someone's spare socks? You stand again, your knees creaking slightly, an echo of old parchment. You walk back toward the main corridor, glancing one last time at the empty shelves. Some call them a loss. Others, a beginning. But you? You call them a reminder that even paper holds the power to stir hearts centuries later. Even silence carries a story. Follow the trail of revolutionary scrolls that may or may not have sparked local uprisings and quiet rebellions. You step carefully from the hollow chamber of loss back into the softer warmth of the archive's inner rooms. There's a hum again, not from the wind this time, but from something deeper. The feeling that stories live here not just as history, but as hidden embers, tucked beneath ash, waiting. You pass beneath a lintel carved with swirling patterns, not decorative, but encoded. Some say the Uighurs hid messages in these swirling motifs, patterns that, if you followed closely, mapped connections between texts. Knowledge wasn't always shelved alphabetically. Sometimes it was shelved politically. And that's where this gets interesting. Not every scroll in these caves was a prayer or a poem. Some were dangerous. In one corner room, low-lit and partially sealed with clay brick, a small wooden chest still rests. Its lid is cracked. Inside, fragments of whisper scrolls. Texts believed to have circulated quietly among certain groups. Not officially banned, no one dared ban a scroll outright, but discouraged, dismissed, quietly exiled from the central shelves. You sit beside the chest and unroll a corner of parchment. The script is hurried, less elegant, the ink darker and more intense, suggesting urgency, maybe even covert copying. The text seems ordinary at first. Philosophical. But then lines that suggest defiance. Metaphors about storms overturning trees, about the silent root unseating the proud cedar. In a religious text, that's evocative. In a desert monastery, it's a whisper of dissent. Historians still argue whether any Uighur uprisings were fueled by these texts. But fragments like this have turned up across various sites, in Turpan, in Kutcha, in dusty, sealed vaults beneath monasteries where scrolls were hidden, not lost. Here's a quirky fact. One such scroll contained a coded calendar. On the surface, it was a list of prayer days and meditation rhythms. But every seventh line contained a different pattern of strokes, subtle changes in character spacing. Once decoded, it revealed a set of instructions for secret nighttime gatherings, held away from official centers, possibly to discuss reform or resistance. The Uighurs lived under shifting political skies, Chinese dynasties, Mongol rule, later Islamic rulers. Their libraries weren't just about remembering the past. They were about surviving the present. And sometimes that meant writing in layers. One layer for the empire. Another for the faithful. And a third, quiet one, for the future. You can almost feel it as you read. The way the script leans, just slightly. Like it's glancing over its shoulder. The way metaphors stack upon each other, words folded in meanings like nesting dolls. One scroll tells the parable of a herder who teaches his sheep to listen to the silence instead of the horn. It ends with the phrase, and then they walked their own path. Depending on who read it, that's either a lovely fable about inner peace, or a metaphor for rejecting authority. You wonder who wrote it. Someone young? Hopeful? Angry? Maybe all three. You reach further into the chest and find a tightly bound scroll with 3 wax seals, broken long ago. The edges are burnt slightly. Was it salvaged from a fire? Or nearly destroyed? You unfurl it carefully. The handwriting is smaller here, squeezed into every available space. A name appears several times, Tegan of the Northern Wall. A monk? A teacher? Or, as some speculate, a rebel organizer? Historians remain divided. Some dismiss these scrolls as symbolic allegories, standard religious mysticism. Others insist they were call-to-action texts, passed quietly from one student to another, like revolutionary leaflets in scroll form. What we know is this: the scrolls disappeared from catalogs by the 14th century. Entire categories vanish from indexes. Rooms that once held political commentary become prayer chambers. Murals of debates are painted over with lotus blossoms and smiling Buddhas. It's not erasure. Not quite. More like intentional forgetting. You sit back and stare at the cracked chest. It's strange to think that in these quiet stone halls, surrounded by cats and incense and tea, someone once risked everything to write a different version of the truth. That paper was a battlefield. That ink was resistance. The whisper scrolls were never shouted from rooftops. They weren't printed en masse or nailed to doors. They were shared, hand to hand, eye to eye. Quiet revolutions. Made not with swords, but with scrolls that breathed louder than they spoke. You rise slowly, placing the parchment back into its resting place. The chest creaks as you close it. Dust swirls once, then settles. Maybe Tegan of the Northern Wall was a myth. Maybe not. But the scrolls are real. Their cracks, their burns, their margins full of anxious little notes. You step out of the chamber, and the wind greets you again. Soft, for now. But always moving. Peek into herbal antifungal techniques, salt crystal wall linings, and heated floor tiles with a grudge against mildew. You make your way along a narrow hallway now, slightly uphill, where the rock under your feet grows warmer. The light here is soft again, almost blue from the way it filters through vents above. The temperature shifts, not colder, not exactly, but dry, even for the desert. The air is crisp in your nostrils, and your skin feels faintly tighter, like stepping into a room made of chalk. And that's the point. Because you've just entered the antifungal wing. A zone where the monks didn't just keep books safe from bugs or bandits, but from the most insidious enemy of all, moisture. Mold. Not the black spots you wipe off your leftovers. The kind that quietly dissolves centuries of parchment. The kind that can spread invisibly through the tiniest corner of a scroll, turning its crisp edges into soft sadness before anyone notices. And here's the thing, the Uighurs saw it coming. You reach out and run your hand along the wall. It feels bumpy. Not natural stone. But not smooth plaster either. Look closely, and you'll see the glitter, tiny salt crystals, deliberately packed into the clay lining. Not just decoration, but a desiccant, a passive humidity buffer. The technique was simple and brilliant: mix salt into the interior clay, particularly on the lower walls where moisture would accumulate. The salt crystals would slowly absorb ambient humidity, locking it into the wall rather than letting it sneak into the scrolls. You can still see where some have risen to the surface over time, ghostly white stars clinging to the stone like frost in a dream. Beside you, in a recessed niche, rests a basket filled with brittle herbs, now long dried. You pick up a bundle and catch the faint scent of wormwood, sage, and a few strands of desert thyme, all known for their antimicrobial properties. These herbs were regularly burned in low ceramic burners, their smoke curling through the chambers in daily rituals. Not for the gods, though maybe that too, but for the manuscripts. Monks kept fumigation logs, noting how often rooms were smoked, which herbs were used, and which scrolls needed to be temporarily removed for sun drying. Some texts were even periodically walked, that is, unrolled gently and laid in the sun like a spa day for ancient paper. A well-treated scroll could last for centuries. A neglected one might rot in silence. quirky tidbit? Some scrolls were wrapped with tiny sachets of dried lizard skin and fermented pear peel. Why? Supposedly, this combo discouraged not just insects, but mildew. Modern scholars debate the actual effectiveness. One translated marginal note simply reads, "Smells bad, works well." There you go. You take a few more steps and notice the floor changing. The stone tiles here are laid tighter, flatter. You kneel and place your palm against one and feel warmth. Yes. This part of the archive had a heated floor system, of sorts. Channels beneath the stone carried warm air from nearby kitchen fires or sun-warmed ventilation shafts. The heat would rise gently through the floor, keeping scrolls dry and feet warm. It wasn't central heating. It was climate cunning. And it had attitude. One scroll warns against sitting too long in the corner of the warming floor, noting that it may anger the tile and cause sleeplessness. Historians believe this was more metaphor than mysticism, perhaps a warning about over-drying, or sitting too close to a thermal vent. You run your fingers over one tile with a faint crack down its center. Inside the crack, a thin thread of crystalline salt. Still doing its job. Still fighting the same quiet war. You sit again, this time against a stone bench embedded with a strip of copper, a conductor. Possibly used to redirect excess heat from one room to another. Possibly decorative. Possibly both. You imagine the monks here, not reading or writing, but tending. This was maintenance work. Sacred janitorial duty. Checking salt levels. Topping off herb bundles. Whispering apologies to scrolls too brittle to handle. They didn't just love the words, they loved the conditions that made the words survive. Historians still argue whether these antifungal strategies were homegrown innovations or borrowed from Persian and Chinese practices. Some similarities exist, especially in salt applications. But the combination of salt linings, floor heating, and herbal fumigation seems uniquely Uyghur in its completeness. You rise again, your joints clicking softly like book clasps being undone. The air feels even drier now. Your lips crack slightly at the corners. You lick them without thinking and wonder, did the monks ever worry that their own breath would harm the scrolls? Turns out, yes. In another chamber nearby, you later learn, some scribes wore mouth veils, thin cloths over their faces, not for religious reasons, but to keep saliva off the page. It was a way of writing with reverence. A physical reminder that every exhale has weight. You smile at that. There's something beautiful about fighting moisture with fire, herbs, and sheer willpower. You take one last look at the room before stepping out. Salt. Heat. Smoke. Quiet. This is where the scrolls stayed alive. Not through magic, but through meticulous care. You end up deep in a frescoed cave, where forgotten chants and sun-bleached wisdom swirl like sand. You continue through the corridor, now deeper than you've gone before. The stone around you darkens, not in color, but in feel, rougher, cooler, almost echoing with its own breath. Your steps become slower, more deliberate. This part of the library complex feels older. Less restored. Less touched. More remembered by the stone than by men. The corridor opens suddenly, as if the mountain itself exhales, and you find yourself in the most beautiful chamber yet. A frescoed cave, larger than the others, with walls that stretch upward into a high dome painted in concentric circles. Each band is filled with color, faded, flaked, but still vibrant in spirit. Gold leaf once flickered here, you can see the remnants glinting where light from a high vent spills in, soft and amber. You stand there for a moment, awed. The figures painted on the walls seem to watch you gently, monks in procession, celestial beings riding clouds, bodhisattvas smiling with closed eyes, as if dreaming of a library too perfect to write down. The pigments were made from crushed stone, lapis, ochre, malachite, and even now, they whisper. Your footsteps disturb nothing. Dust here doesn't seem to settle. It floats, suspended in the hush. You notice alcoves carved around the perimeter. 7 of them, each with a niche, each likely used for scrolls or for meditation. One still holds a statue, weathered and cracked, seated in the lotus position. A soft smile plays on its lips, a knowing expression carved by someone who clearly understood the joy of unread pages. You sit cross-legged on the stone floor. The dome above creates a natural acoustic pocket. Even the smallest sound, your breath, a shift in cloth, seems to return to you like a sigh from the past. And then, softly, you begin to hear it. Not literally. Not quite. But it comes to you anyway. Chanting. You imagine it. Low voices in unison, no instruments, just tone and intention. Each syllable echoing off the curved ceiling, each vibration weaving into the stone. They didn't sing for performance. They chanted to shape the air. To fill the emptiness with rhythm. Like smoothing a blanket over the silence. You imagine monks here, seated where you now sit. Rows of them, backs straight, voices resonating together like a breath held across time. Perhaps it was here that young students first recited their lessons. Where elders intoned sutras in the evening. Where someone first whispered a verse that would survive long after his name didn't. A small breeze moves through the room, just enough to stir your sleeves. And you look up. The ceiling's central circle, the mandala, is faded now, but still legible. A wheel, 8-spoked, surrounded by flames, clouds, and a ring of what seem to be books with wings. Symbolic, of course, but you can't help but smile at the idea of airborne wisdom circling the heavens. One painted figure, seated at the edge of the wheel, is holding a scroll. His mouth is open, chanting? Speaking? Laughing? No one knows. His eyes are wide, though. Alert. As if still watching for the next reader to arrive. You rise slowly and walk toward a large niche at the rear. It holds a single scroll replica, perhaps, or left as an offering. Its casing is wrapped in golden silk, aged to buttercream softness. You don't open it. You don't need to. The point isn't the text. It's that it remains. Historians often refer to this room, when they refer to it at all, as the memory cave. Not because of what was written here, but because of how it felt to be here. Several 19th century travelers recorded that entering this chamber changed their breathing, slowed their speech, made them forget what time it was. Some left without speaking. Others claimed they dreamt about it for weeks. One German scholar wrote, "It is not a room. It is a bell that has already been struck." You understand now. Because sitting here, surrounded by the remnants of Incan chant and sun-stained frescoes, you feel not alone, but woven. As though your presence here is one more thread in a story that the library itself continues to tell. You lean against the wall, stone cool against your back, and close your eyes. For a moment, the painted figures hum again. The scrolls exhale. And the silence returns, not empty, but full.